Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of this winter seminar series. He is an Oxford-based author and ecologist, and you would probably have known him from his work on hedgehogs, because Hugh Warwick is mainly known as Hedgehog Hugh, and in fact, he is the only person I know who has had a children's song written pretty much about him. So if you want to improve your street cred with small people, you could name drop Hedgehog Hugh, Nick Pope's song. That's Hedgehog Hugh. But today, Hedgehog Hugh is actually going to talk to us about a slightly darker twist on conservation efforts. He's going to talk about culling in the name of conservation, and the hedgehogs will make an appearance, but perhaps in a different context to what you normally present them in.
Have you seen the title of the talk?
Yes, I have seen the title of the talk. So I think without further ado, there will be opportunities to buy books later, and I will mention special discounts and all that after the talk. But I think for now, I would like to give the floor and a warm welcome to Hugh Warwick.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And also, this is going to be quite a challenge. I'm told actually I have 45 minutes to talk. So when I went through this talk, which was running at an hour and a quarter last time I did it, I decided to chop loads out and then added 2 more slides. So the only valid alternative is just to speak a lot faster. So, should we kill hedgehogs? Hands up who thinks we should kill some hedgehogs. No. Okay. Well, yeah, horrible. Anyway, so this is the starting point of my research way back when I was very young. I began my field work on this work. Pointer. Yes, there we go. That little dot just there. Anyone familiar with North Ronaldsay? Has anyone been to North Ronaldsay? It's a remarkably remote, quite tiny, very flat little island. 5 miles long, about a mile wide. And in 1974, the postman, Mr. John Tuck, decided to introduce hedgehogs to his garden because there were no hedgehogs on the island, and he had heard that hedgehogs were a fantastic way of controlling garden pests. So that seemed like a good, logical thing to do, as there had been no hedgehogs on the island before. Fine. By 1985, the Daily Express, one of the possibly less reliable scientific journals, was suggesting there were 10,000 hedgehogs on North Ronaldsay, and they were causing havoc with the ground nesting birds. Now, North Ronaldsay, like most of Orkney, is fairly devoid of trees. There is actually a small patch of shrubs there, but that's like the forest. Nothing over 8 foot tall, but it's at least something to hang the mist nets on. And so this is an island where the birds are nesting on the ground. Hedgehogs were thought, as their numbers have been seen to increase, to be responsible for the decrease in the breeding success of many of the ground nesting birds. I went up there as at Leicester Polytechnic, and it was my 3rd year project to go and count hedgehogs. I remember coming back to Leicester Polytechnic and being asked by less imaginative students, why were you counting hedgehogs? And I said, to find out how many there were. It's sometimes you do wonder whether people should be doing a degree. It wasn't 10,000, it was around 500 hedgehogs on the island, and there was evidence that the hedgehogs were eating birds' eggs. They leave a very distinctive indentation in the eggs as they munch on them. And in particular, the concern was about these beautiful beastie of the Arctic terns. And this is a bird I became very familiar with the view from this angle. I went back in 1991 as well to repeat the work after the Bird Observatory had organised an airlift of hedgehogs from the island back in 1986. It's one of those things which was a really fantastic bit of publicity for the Bird Observatory, got all over the news coverage, even got a Japanese TV crew turning up. And none of the Japanese TV crew spoke any English, and most of the people on North Ronaldsay were drunk and had a very, very strong Orcadian accent. And there was a moment when Tarzan, the black Labrador, who had been kept bringing me hedgehogs, only male hedgehogs because they smell more, and his mouth would be covered in blood as the spines and pierced his gums. And so this was part of the story. The Japanese crew were covering, and so Tarzan was in a little croft, and they were talking about this thing, and then there's a little hedgehog, and in front of the Japanese TV crew, Tarzan bit the hedgehog's head off. And so somewhere, you know how Clive James used to do that TV series, laughing at weird things that people did in Japan? I am sure there is a reciprocal show which involves that clip. Luckily, nothing to do with me, because I didn't see a reason to remove the hedgehogs. So, there being a plan to shift hedgehogs unscientifically without any sense of sort of monitoring off North Ronaldsay. I had found when I was up there that actually the Arctic terns in particular were suffering a massive reduction in the amount of food that they were bringing to their chicks. Counting sand eels in their beaks, monitoring the length of the sand eels by the length of the beak, and it was much less than other surveys have shown. Also, anybody who has walked through Arctic tern colonies, anyone had the pleasure of walking through an Arctic tern colony? So you will know why in Orkney they call them pecky turner. And those beaks are designed, specifically, never mind the sand eels, they're basically designed and employed to pierce human skulls. And they will hover above your head and then dive on you and shriek if they can't quite get to you. So spending 3 hours sitting watching Arctic tern colonies, counting sand eels day after day after day, does leave you a gibbering wreck. Just this is one of those things, the problems of fieldwork. Anyway, I ended up with this story. They've shifted 200 hedgehogs off the island. They seem to drift out of sight and mind. People had thought the hedgehogs had all gone from North Ronaldsay. Then other stuff took over my life until 2003. If you remember back then, the story of the Uists in the Outer Hebrides. Hedgehogs, same sort of year, 1974, were introduced to South Uist. They spread up through South Uist into Ben Beckula and on to North Uist a little bit. And with the spread of the hedgehogs, again, came a decreasing breeding success of ground nesting birds. This time, however, in 2003, the conservationists went a very different path. And this was the sort of headlines: green light for hedgehog cull was given. The plan was to kill hedgehogs. Now, I had supplied the ecologist I knew who was doing the feasibility study for this work with all the work I've done in North Ronaldsay, and then being busy doing other things, not paying attention to the story. So I had assumed that they'd discovered a reason why hedgehogs couldn't be moved alive to the mainland, which seemed like a logical thing to do. And when I went up there, I ended up going up there at the start of the cull to record a programme for Radio 4's Natural History programme, and we were told very clearly, the assembled press, of which there were a lot, that the reason hedgehogs could not be moved alive is that if they were moved alive, they would suffer slow and lingering deaths. And we were told that we couldn't know the names or see the faces of the people doing the cull because of the dangerous animal rights activists on the island. I'd just been talking to the dangerous animal rights activists on the island. They were a bunch of really sweet animal welfare fans who were rescuing hedgehogs rather than seeing them killed. So it was a really interesting story up there. And then I dug a little deeper, found that some of the research used to justify killing the hedgehogs actually came from my fieldwork radio tracking hedgehogs in Devon. And the example they gave was 12 hedgehogs I released, 5 of them died. So therefore we can't be releasing hedgehogs into the mainland. But none of my 5 died slow and lingering deaths. They were all fast and violent. 3 of them were eaten by badgers and 2 of them were run over by cars. So I got disgruntled. I joined the campaign against the cull and ended up getting 20 hedgehogs from the Outer Hebrides, radio tracking them to see whether they did indeed suffer slow and lingering deaths, and wrote a paper which showed they basically behaved like normal hedgehogs. Life in the Outer Hebrides had not granted them immortality. However, nothing peculiar happened. They were able to eat. They were able to find their way around. So we got the cull stopped. Very pleased with that. Conservation, killing for conservation. It looked like it was the odd answer. I ended up writing something which then I discovered didn't go down well with the Daily Mail, pointing out that there's a tendency towards the Daily Mail style of conservation, which is if there's a problem, you look to the newcomer who is a bit different to all the rest, and you blame them. And that's what they did with the hedgehogs. Actually, same with up in Orkney, a whole host of other problems affecting the ground nesting birds. Hedgehogs were part of it. Possibly we don't need to kill them. In the end, they didn't. They no longer kill them, and in fact, I'm now part of the technical advisory group working with the people who were originally killing hedgehogs. It's long, complicated, involved story, which then became even more interesting when I went to the European Hedgehog Research Group conference in Munster, in Germany, and met a conservationist from New Zealand who was coming over to explain why they were killing hedgehogs in New Zealand. And I was like, oh no, you don't need to do that. I've just shown you don't need to do that. And he said, okay, but what else are we going to do? And he's got the evidence which showed that hedgehogs are not native to New Zealand. Hedgehogs were introduced to New Zealand in the 1860s because when people, the colonists arrived there, the Europeans arrived there, particularly people from England, they got there and they looked around this place, thought, this place is gorgeous, really gorgeous, but you know what it's missing. And they wrote back to England and said, please send hedgehogs. And so hedgehogs were sent, a whole bunch of animals were sent out there. The acclimatization societies were set up to make people feel more comfortable in their new homes, and the end result is the massive degradation of the ecosystems of New Zealand. And the evidence is very clear that hedgehogs do have a conservation level impact in New Zealand on many endemic species, which will eventually be wiped out. This began the process which ended up with this book. I was absolutely hit by the head versus heart conundrum. My head was being twisted, turned by all of this tedious evidence, whereas my heart knew exactly that it was right. So I ended up writing an article which got me a little bit of flack, basically saying I can't see a reason not to kill the hedgehogs in New Zealand. There is no point collecting them up and sticking them in a hedgehog hotel until they die of natural causes. Contraceptives don't work for obvious reasons. And no, we are not going to ship them back to England. Please, God, the number of times people write to me with semi-thought-out plans about this. I've actually produced a 2-page retort because it is tedious. Anyway, so this was the starting point for Cull of the Wild, which has been the most interesting and challenging journey of a book I've ever written. Thank you, George. Fascinating, intelligent, and indispensable, he said, and that wasn't even me doing it for him. It was.
He's talking about the squirrels.
The squirrel, yeah, they are. So I was. So it's a really interesting sort of process of diving into this, and I have a number of philosophers to thank because this is very, very murky territory for a sort of baby ecologist to dip their toes into. And I talked to, there's 3 in particular, who held my hand and gave me guidance because part of the problem I was struggling with, which I didn't know, was the difference between right and wrong versus good and bad. And I hadn't really thought this through, and the fact that what I thought I was, which turns out, I can use the word deontological now and know what it means. Never had that happen before this book. So I used to think I was a deontologist, that I thought things were right and wrong, thou shalt not kill, that sort of thing. And I was rather sniffy about the utilitarians who go around weighing things up and measuring things and being a bit like, oh, well, maybe a bit of this and a bit of that. So one of my philosopher friends said, you should read this book. Would you kill the fat man? Are you familiar with trolley problems, tram problems? So this was that idea. It's like, actually, yes, it's wrong to kill somebody, but if, I'm not suggesting you go and kill people, but there are examples in the book where it sets out where you might just be thinking, I should do something which technically is not right, but it is good. And I became, I've now discovered that I want to describe myself as a reluctant utilitarian. I still have the head and the heart clashing on a regular basis. I still find myself, you can't do that, oh, shit. Sorry, smaller people in the audience. Oh, sugar. There are times when I really, really want to find really good reasons why simply it would be to just take the path of not killing. Wouldn't that be nice? Just not to kill things. Here follows a few examples where mammals got into trouble and people killed them. Lundy is gorgeous. Little dot, there we go. Little Lundy. Lots of animals introduced to Lundy over the years by people, but the rats were obviously the thing in point. And I was interested by this because Lundy's rats, this was one of the last breeding populations of black rats in the United Kingdom. It was the only place that black rats and brown rats were living together. Fascinating place for study. But it was determined that a bunch of puffins and Manx shearwaters were more important than the rats. So in 2002, they eradicated the rats from the island. And the reason they did this, I couldn't remember all the numbers. In 1939, there were 3,500 puffin on the island. In the year 2000, there were 13 puffin. And no successful breeding since 1986. Manx shearwaters, 90% of the world's Manx shearwaters live in the United Kingdom. In the year 2000, there were just 166 pairs, and there'd been no successful breeding since 1959. They killed all the rats in 2002, and last year they did a survey, 10,000 pairs of Manx shearwaters and 1,200 puffin. It was the rats what did it. And it was something which it was sort of one of those stories. I can really see why you did this. Very limited chance of other animals being injured by the application of poison. Okay. I mean, it is pretty if you haven't been to London. Really, really worth it. There was dolphins on the way back too. And they still have bait stations scattered around the island. This is where the ferry comes in. But the main thing they've got is a massive regime of biosecurity in place. No boat is allowed to come to the pier, apart from the ferry, and that one is checked very regularly. They have bait boxes scattered around the island, which don't contain poison, but just contain chocolate-scented wax blocks, which the rats find irresistible. They're checked regularly for teeth marks. No rats have been seen on the island since 2002. So this is a project which seems to have worked, and I can't see a reason not to do it, even though it would be lovely to hang out with a black rat again. They are very, very pretty, but not very nice to share rooms with because they breed very fast and they did infest quite a lot. So, there we go. Whoops, you know one of those. This is an audience, I don't need to go into the details about the grey squirrel, red squirrel debate, but who thinks we should kill the grey squirrels? That's interesting. Okay, fine. So, grey squirrels, the spread of the grey squirrels causes the demise of the red squirrels, in particular because of the squirrel pox virus that the grey squirrels carry and kills the red squirrels. I went to Anglesey to link up with Craig Shuttleworth, who has returned red squirrels to the island. And he did that by killing around 7,000 grey squirrels with a priest. I was doing start of the week. Adam Rutherford didn't know a priest was a small truncheon, and it caused one of those moments which went out on live radio of real confusion. Wandering around with some geezer in a frock banging squirrels doesn't work efficiently. And the reason he did that was because it meant live trapping, squirrel, you can see it's the right species, you're not having any bycatch, they run into a sack, you whack them over the head with the truncheon. And it sounds brutal, but it means there's absolutely no chance the wrong species is going to die. You're not poisoning, so there's no poison going into the environment. And it is the most humane way of doing it. I was questioning whether he had been desensitized in any way by this process, but obviously my line of questioning had resulted in him becoming a little... He's basically said, are you trying to find out whether I was a psychopath before I started, or whether this work turned me into a psychopath? And he was very sensitive. In fact, he was quite shy about being interviewed. And it turns out that a few years beforehand, he'd done a piece on the BBC, and some animal rights activists who got hold of his name, his address, where he lived with his children, posted that everywhere, and a torrent of very aggressive abuse was directed towards him. And so he was actually quite shy about coming forwards. But his work, killing 7,000 grey squirrels, means there are now red squirrels on the island. And the Menai Straits are turbulent waters, but when the tides are about to change, there's still enough to allow squirrels to make it across. Squirrels do hitchhike. They've killed 14 greys on the island this year because they've got in either hitchhiking or going across the bridge. So they're still very vigilant. I was asking them, was he planning on then spreading the cull out onto mainland Wales to just to start getting rid of more squirrels? And he looked at me, basically, you've missed the point. He's not interested in killing grey squirrels for the sake of killing grey squirrels. He was interested in getting red squirrels back to the island, in eradicating the problem, which was the grey squirrels. If you start killing grey squirrels on the mainland, all you're doing is harvesting grey squirrels. You do it forever, because they're going to keep on breeding. So when it comes down to the idea, should we kill grey squirrels, do we go, this was a Patrick Barkamard article in The Guardian. People up in Northumberland really, really like it. Kill them, kill them, kill them. They're really keen on killing grey squirrels. But this is a harvest. This is a thing which has to go on forever. And it's something which is very different to the work that he was doing, which is going in, finding a discrete area, eradicating the grey squirrels, and then moving on. I am minded to agree with him that the idea of trying to kill all the grey squirrels is pointless. There is some interesting work going on now with contraceptives in as much as they've got a hopper design which will only let in grey squirrels. They've all sorts of clever work with cameras monitoring different squirrels coming to different hopper designs. Anyway, they've got ones now. Only grey squirrels can get in, so they're going to start, when they've developed the contraceptive, to start to reduce the breeding success of the grey squirrels, which will be a non-lethal way forward, which would be great. This one might be an easier one. Who thinks we should kill the mink? Mink are fantastic. They are so gorgeous. I actually wrote this book with a mink coat hanging next to me in my office shed. It's not as weird as it, well, it is quite strange. When my mother died, I was cleaning out the house and I hadn't realised that the mink coat was still there. It was in the back of a wardrobe, no other doors beyond it. And so I thought, what else are you going to do with a mink coat? And then I stroked it and it was like, oh my goodness, that is so lovely. And the whole Proustian thing kicked off. And I could smell her perfume as she went over to kiss me goodnight when she was going out, all those things when she was wearing the coat. So it's like, okay, so the mink coat stays with me. They are an amazing animal, a fantastic sentient predator, but just really, really shouldn't be here. Now, there are some really interesting arguments about how the mink escaped. Actually, they were being breeding in the wild pretty much as soon as they were being brought over here in the 1930s for the mink industry. The easy answer is, it was animal rights activists releasing them, but I have talked to other people who have said, yes, but there is evidence that there were mink farms themselves who were going, we can blame the animal rights activists and get the insurance money because the mink industry is going under anyway. So they escaped their breeding. And if you want to bring back water voles to an area, you can do all of the riparian management you like. You can make everything gorgeous and you can move the cattle away and stop the harvest being brought right up to the edge of the water. You can keep dogs off, all of that stuff. But if the mink is still there, then the mink are going to get eaten. Sorry, the water voles are going to get eaten. Must get that the right way around. Then I was thinking, well, this is interesting. I think it's fairly straightforward. But how on earth do you go about it? It's that idea. Do you just keep on doing it again and again and again, spending the money, spending the time? The more years that you end up controlling a species, the more animals get killed. Actually, if you want to kill fewer animals, do it quickly, because they're not breeding. So then it was actually Tom Morehouse pointed me towards Tony Martin, Professor Tony Anthony Martin, and he said, yeah, let's have a chat about this, because I think I've made a breakthrough. And I didn't know anything about him until I turned up. What I now know about him is that he is wonderfully creative and energetic. This is his back garden. And he loves wildfowl, and it's just absolutely filled with wildfowl. We sat in his conservatory, which looks out over this, and it was really quite distracting. But he was really excited because he'd just published something which argued that he reckoned he could get rid of all of the mink from mainland Britain. All of them. He had started in East Anglia and using these remote sensing mink traps developed by the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and the idea is a mink or something goes into the trap, triggers off a signal, and his rather, I felt tastelessly, his phone has a hunting horn sound when something's in one of the traps. But all over East Anglia, when a trap is set off, goes off or whatever you've got on your phone, and whoever's nearest goes and checks. And if it's a mink, they get killed. If it's not a mink, the animals get released. And so far, so good. But why do you think this is going to work over the entire... So why don't you start on the islands? Start on in the US, for goodness sake, because surely a discrete population is easy to deal with. And he said, the thing is, you can't do that humanely. Because if you set your trap, and then the thing goes off, and there's an animal in the trap, but you can't get to the island, and you've got a 3-hour walk across a moor to actually find where the trap is, and the weather's really bad, you'll end up having animals starving to death in the traps. And he said, you can't do that. That's wrong. You've got to get to it within an hour or so, just because that is the most humane way of doing it. And I thought that was quite an interesting process. Still creating obstacles. But why does he think he can do it for Britain, for mainland Britain? Well, East Anglia is pretty much mink-free now, thanks to him. And it's just remarkable. And he says, what has happened is, and he didn't know, he thought there'd be a long tail. With all these sorts of projects, you end up, as the population gets more dispersed, they become harder to find the last of them. And he said, what has happened is, it's just dropped. And it's something called the Ely effect, that actually you end up with not overcrowding, it'd be undercrowding. You end up, when you get below a certain number in the population, they're simply not meeting. None of the females coming in have had young. So they're simply not meeting, they're not mating, they're not producing young. The population has absolutely dropped. He thinks that with a relatively small amount of money, you could remove the mink from mainland Britain. And the chances of reinfection, and at some point must talk about the idea of how we talk about these things, because the process of othering the species, which is considered to be the problem, has the capacity to change the way you treat them. And it's really, really important to, not reinfection, but the chances of getting mink back into mainland Britain are actually very low. It's quite a controllable thing. So there is the possibility this could work. And the reason he wanted to sort of push on this is that he wanted another project, because he'd just done something utterly ridiculously remarkable. Another little dot in the ocean. South Georgia, famous from Falklands War, famous for being a great base for sealers and whalers. And bizarrely, this situation, when the whales and the seals stopped being killed and their population started to grow again, the residue that was left behind by the people, the humans who are out there, of the rodents, carried on causing the problems. And you ended up with a situation now that the breeding success of birds on South Georgia had been massively hammered. So they went in there to try and eradicate the rats on an entire island, right in the middle of the sea. And it took 3 years, at least 10,000 tea bags, I remember reading in the list, and lots of work, flying helicopters, dropping poison. And it was, for me, interesting, the care with which Tony talked about making sure the mink weren't left to suffer, compared to, I would say, the disregard for the suffering of rats, being given a vast amount of anticoagulant bait to eat. It was just one of those moments of speciesism. We all have it. We have these hierarchies of care. And so he was more concerned about the suffering of the mink than he was about the suffering of the rats. And there is no way that you can, this is not a sweet and nice little, Soylent Green type moment when the rats are taken into a quiet room and given their favourite music and they drift off into their death, surrounded by beautiful video images of their favourite lumps of cheese. It's not like that at all. It's cruel. And this is something which is really important to recognise. When you are looking at your utilitarian spreadsheet of these things, it's very easy to look at it from the point of view of cost and numbers, etc. But very few of these spreadsheets actually includes cruelty, which is something which I feel is missing. I think it's important to do that. However, they did it. They managed to remove all of the rats. So that is the last rat they found on the island. The skin off, kept in his freezer with some other. He's got a really interesting freezer. And his, if you wanted to lure the mink into those traps, what he does, he says he didn't get COVID. And he knows why. Because every dead mink he got, he would then squeeze the anal glands to exude a wonderful fluid, which he would dab onto cigarette filters. And then these cigarette filters he would keep in a bag in the freezer. And then when they were needed, they would put in those little plastic golf balls with lots of holes in them. And so they would dangle in there. Really, really good. Lasts about 3 months. And so he got one of these frozen bags out of the freezer. And it was absolutely staggering. It was like, if you've ever done that thing when you've gone away on holiday, having left a bunch of onions at the bottom of your vegetable tray, and then you come back and you find those slightly sort of mashy, dark onions, and then you keep them in the armpit of a friend of yours who's really nervous for about a month. And it was just amazing. And he said, yeah, these are frozen. Imagine what that's like fresh. Nobody came near him So he managed to avoid it. It may be quite an excessive way of keeping social distancing going, but anyway, it did it for him. So I went back to Orkney because any excuse is good, and February, I had a day like this, and in February that was so unusual, so I went to photographs for the Highland Whiskey Distillery advertising campaign. I love it up there. But I was mainly up there to meet Spud, who is, I think, possibly the most handsome dog I've ever met. I mean, really, he is quite wonderful. So the Orkney Native Wildlife Project was set up because in 2011 they found stoats on mainland Orkney in 2 different places, 30 miles apart, which is about as far apart as you can get. They don't know how the stoats got there. They're not really inveterate hitchhikers. There is a possibility that a farmer thought, I can control the rabbits in my fields with this. It's possible that some of the farmers, a bit annoyed with the RSPB, said, you know what, teach them a thing or two. We don't know how it happened, but it happened. And stoats are quite possibly the most devastating animal to get landing on your island. Stoats are staggeringly efficient breeders. Female stoats are always pregnant. As soon as a female has given birth, a male will come into the nest and will mate with her. But he will also mate with all the female kits. Well, that's quite a reaction. Just you wait till I tell you how hedgehogs give birth. But this is they're too small to become pregnant, so they have delayed implantation. So basically, any female stoat is pregnant when it's out and about. So the capacity to breed is very, very extreme, brilliantly done. And Orkney is... So they got in touch with people in New Zealand, more of New Zealand in a minute, and they say, yeah, you've got to act fast, So they've got traps all the way around the island, because the worst thing that could happen is for the remote islands to become visited, populated by the stoats. So, as you know, with Orkney, it's connected, a number of the islands are connected by the Churchill barrages, so all the way through, stoats have covered, very quickly spread themselves across the islands. The traps were keeping it under control. They then had to do, and this was I found fascinating, and a number of the people I've spoken to about various projects were very keen to stress it. There's no point doing this unless you have societal back buy-in. And you've got to weigh up your social capital with your economic capital. You may have all the money to do this sort of thing, but if you don't have the community willing to work with you, it's not going to work. Simply, it won't work. So this is something, whether it's been on islands off Australia or Scilly Isles, almost more time is spent talking to people, gaining access to land and getting them to work with you than it is actually doing the work. So the stoat work was doing quite well until, unfortunately, COVID kicked in. They had to stop, and obviously they stopped, but the stoats didn't. So all that work was undone. They're now back on the case, and what they use Spud and other dogs for is to, when they found a trap which is being set and sprung, Spud then goes to the area to see whether it's fresh or whether it's old. He can sniff out stoat scat at some considerable distance. In fact, his stoat scat sniffing ability is, there's a very, very long tongue twister coming out of this one, I'm sure, is remarkable. I was wanting this photograph. This is the sea was rushing in between us. This is a little peninsula hanging out there. They're walking into the wind. It's got that photograph, walking around through the tusky grass. I missed the excitement. But Spud had pulled his handler back 20 metres downwind and straight to dried stoat scat in the tusky grass. And the idea of what Spud's imagining of the world is like, that he was able to, downwind from where he was walking, and Orkney winds are not just winds, these are proper winds, is quite, I just love that idea, what he could do. He was excited because he gets to play with his ball, and the conservationists were quite happy because these were old and dried scat. They're probably a couple of weeks old, so there had been no other sightings and no trails. The work they do is done, again, very carefully. These are New Zealand traps, which are only stoats and smaller can get in, so otters can't get in. And the trails are set so that only an animal the weight of stoat can set them off. Otters will only get in if they've got access to power tools. So they're quite happy that they think otters will be able to get in there. They've not had any bycatch yet. So there are these different experiences which people are having. They're working in there, they're going and killing mammals, and they are creating, hopefully, good conservation outcomes. Back to New Zealand, which is, as we know, the Acclimatisation Society has done so much to enrich the ecosystems of the islands. And now they have this described as their moonshot, predator-free New Zealand by 2050. That's the plan. And that's 2050, they're going to aim to get rid of all of the possums, rats, stoats, ferrets, weasels, and feral cats. Hedgehogs actually don't make it onto the top list. They're part of the problem, but not quite as big as the others. And this is such an enormous and grand idea. And I was like, man, it's being pulled along by this. This sounds amazing. What an amazing achievement. I was introduced to Zealandia, which I've never been to New Zealand, but I've watched Lord of the Rings a lot of times, so I know it's cute. And Zealandia. So talking to conservationists, people I know who used to live in New Zealand, they talk about, they said, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. That ain't got nothing on what we've got here. We have silent years. Just forests which used to be cacophonous with insects and bird life are silent because all of those terrestrial predators are in there causing chaos. And so there's a real move to try and do this, but it's strange. It's quite sort of jingoistic. It's become very much a flag-waving thing. The school kids are encouraged to kill as many possums as they can. And I was reading interesting research, looking at the impact, long-term impact on the psychology of people who've been brought up to think that you can other species, individuals, whatever, so effectively, and the long-term repercussions in terms of their ability to be cruel. Zealandia, though, is a case which I would love to visit. They've done their best to turn it right back in time, before the arrival of people. And there is a lot of very good reasons why indigenous populations around the world are fated for their ability to maintain and conserve species. New Zealand, when the Polynesians arrived out there, that was preceded immediately by the mass extinctions of the large megafauna, the moa and other species like that. Where we go, we tend to kill. In fact, so much so, I suggested a new name for our species. Homo sapiens, I feel, is slightly ironic given our condition. So I was suggesting Homo ochisaur, man the killer, might be slightly more appropriate. Then I started writing a proposal for a book about this, and then I realised it would be really depressing, and so I stopped. Anyway, Zealandia, they've removed all of the invasive non-native species from Zealandia, and apparently it is a remarkable space to be in. But I was talking to Wayne Linklater, a conservationist from Sorry, I'm just realising how... Okay, anyway, I'll speed up. And he said, one of the problems you've got is, he's a New Zealander and he lives in America now, and he said one of the problems is that we have this vision of New Zealand. We know New Zealand is like this. We know it is absolutely gorgeous. And actually, New Zealand is one of the most degraded, fragmented, and upset countries on the planet. It is, after humans had arrived and removed the moa, and then the colonists arrived, and we were whaling off there, killing the seals. Then there was the forestry, amazing wood that they'd got on there, so that was removed. And then the mineral mining and now the industrial agriculture. New Zealand is not like the adverts would suggest. And he argued, and I thought really quite credibly, that one of the problems we've got is that the scapegoat are the invasive non-native species. And if you've got a country which has got a really robust, strong ecosystem, the chance that they will be able to cope with, absorb, and be able to integrate other species is much higher. When you've already degraded your landscape to the sort of extent that we've got here, they've got there, you are much more likely to find that those niches are available and are going to be used by the animals that are there. And that the big picture is actually, let's try and return countries back to the sort of ecologically robust state that they can then cope with these things, rather than going in and blaming the invasive non-native species and killing them, and I reiterate, in many instances in a really cruel way. Australia and New Zealand are very keen on a poison called 1080, because it's based on chemicals found in plants in Australia in particular, and so the native wildlife are pretty much immune to it. I've read the descriptions of what to look for in your dog if it inadvertently picks up one of the 1080 laced sausages, which are scattered in the hundreds or thousands, either maybe millions of pieces around Australia each year. There is no way that is not staggeringly and hideously cruel. So there is an awful lot to hold in your mind when you look at these things. How far are we willing to go to try and return something to what? What are we trying to achieve? What is the line we're trying to pull things back to? Zealandia is pulling it right back to pre-human times, and fantastic in a discrete area. But the United Kingdom, what are we going to aim for? What are we going to go for? I don't know, the Neolithic? I don't know. I mean, go back to that, maybe not. I mean, we're going to get rid of all the hares, get rid of half our deer species. I mean, I don't know, how many 9 of our mammals are they visitors, naturalized? You know, what is the point? Where is the line we're trying to achieve? What is it actually we're trying to achieve? What Wayne Linklater pointed out is that you look at the loss of a species as a tragedy, as an ecological tragedy. It's not. Not being able to breathe clean air is an ecological tragedy. Not having clean water to drink is a tragedy. Not having an ecosystem which is able to function properly because you've totally messed it up, that's a tragedy. The loss of a species here or there, get over it. I didn't necessarily agree with everything he said, but it was a really quite a challenging argument he put forward. Never mind then moving on to the compassionate conservationists who I talked to as well. I'm noticing the time. However, I wanted also, in the process of writing this book, to go and talk to people who were killing animals for conservation in this country, but with maybe a slightly different sort of bent. And I was doing a hen harrier. Has anyone been to one of the hen harrier days that Chris Packham organises? They always rain. So much so that there is a point now that we're going to start organising them in parts of the country suffering from drought. I don't think there's been a single one where it hasn't absolutely poured in rain. Anyway, I was talking at one of the hen harrier days up in Cheshire, and I've been and done filming in Chris's house, gardens in the New Forest with Megan and with Chris, and it was fascinating to sort of hear quite the level of abuse and threats that he gets. The death threats are considered so real that the police advise him at public events like this to have bodyguards. He has to hire security for him because people have threatened to kill him. He's more worried about people threatening to kill Sid and Nancy. When I was last there, they were just replacing the gates. I've seen the video of that. The people who drove the vehicle up to the gates got out of the vehicle and caused it to explode. It wasn't just somebody sloshing petrol around. As the police had said, these were people who knew what they were doing. This is part of the problem with having these conversations in this country generates, is because the feelings are so strong that somebody who is arguing against hunting, against the work of some of the gamekeepers out there, is going to have dead animals nailed to his gate and death threats. And I would also point out that people who are going out there and hunting for pleasure are also going to receive death threats. It's the norm. This is not an area for fertile conversation. But I needed to step outside of my bubble, in particular because the first draft of this book, the first word of it was prejudice, and I was laying out my prejudices because I wanted to be honest and clear with them, because we all have them. And those prejudices actually infect the way we view the world. We're inside our little bubbles, and our bubbles are very self-reinforcing, and you'll always find you tend to be on the outer edge of your bubble because the bubble is telling you you're really quite a wimp when it comes to your views on this, that, or the other. And the wall of this bubble will distort the views you have of other people in their bubbles. So it becomes a really challenging way of having honest conversations. So I'm going to be honest. I'm an animal lover. I have a hedgehog tattoo. I will get a badger tattoo at some point. I am a vegan. I used to be a strict vegan, but over time realised that my willpower was not as strong as Women's Institute cakes were good. So I'm vaguely vegan. So I pressed putting all these out, and I ended up going and meeting Jonathan Reynolds, who was at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. He's interested in field sports and goes out and does stuff which involves killing animals. But we began a conversation about shared loves of nature, shared love of music. That was interesting. In fact, the biggest challenge we had was when we came to a conversation about who had recorded the best version of Sibelius' Fifth Symphony. It's amazing how far you can get when you begin at the points of agreement rather than beginning your conversation at the point of disagreement. I then went and met up with Mike Swan, also Game Wildlife Conservation Trust, much more active gamekeeper. He took me on a drive around his estate. He said, he described it like he manages his estate. It's not his land. He manages it for his favourite pastime, which is an armed nature animal. He likes shooting stuff and eating it. That's what he likes to do. We disagree about that. However, I saw more wildlife on this estate. There's 3 hares in that picture. I saw more wildlife on that estate on that one afternoon's drive than I had done all that summer. It's been managed amazingly for wildlife, purely because this is so challenging, because the people who seem to be doing the most and generating the most amount of wildlife in their area, people I think are repugnant in what they do. I find it obscene. It makes me feel physically ill trying to have the conversations I've been having with these people. But, so we need to find a way of how do we do this? Because I can't bridge that gap. Well, when my book came out, I was quite pleased because in the space of 2 days, I had conversations with 2 different people on Twitter. One was Trooper Snooks, a hunter, and we had a conversation about it, about my book. He was a little bit snide at one point. We took it offline, we had a chat. He ended up writing a review of my book, and he actually said, when I first read it, he said, I really loved this book, and then I reread it and says, I nearly loved this book. Anyway, it was close. But 2 days later, the chair of the Hunt Saboteurs Association, we had a bit of something edgy was posted. I was like, well, but maybe we took it offline, we had a conversation. And then again, they also agreed that, and they basically both ended up saying, I disagree with bits of this book, however, I think you should read it. In fact, the review goes as far as to, the wrong button. Here we go. Yes, fascinating yet slightly flawed, says the hunter. Now, for me, this is the beginning. Now, this is just the very, very beginnings of trying to have a conversation in the grey area rather than in the polarised bits and pieces. And so I will end with, because I'm having to miss out a lot, with a bit of wine. I like wine. This is a full wine glass to represent something. Rory Stewart did a series on Radio 4 about 2 years ago, in which he was talking about argument and debate, and in which he talked about basically how political discourse used to form a bell curve, a normal distribution curve, and that on the whole, extreme views were the outliers. They were the ones furthest away, and most people had views in the middle. And what has happened since 2014 with the arrival in particular of social media has been the inversion of that bell curve into an empty wine glass. And we end up having this empty space in the middle, and it's empty in part because when you start speaking from that point of view in the middle, both sides tend to shout at you. And when you, then you're either drawn to one side or the other. I could have sold a lot more of these books if I aligned myself with a side, because then I'd have had support and I'd have had people shouting, and then you get more attention, and that's the way the world goes round. And I have really determined that actually the best way forward with this is to keep the wine glass full, to try and find a way of repopulating that middle ground and having conversations with people you might not necessarily think are your allies, because it's possible that we might all learn more. There's a quote from Joseph Joubert, 18th century he's a philosopher, I suppose, of some sort. But he said, the point of argument is not winning, it's progress. And that, I felt, was a really lovely way to think about this work. I will stop now because I really, really would like some questions. So thank you very much for your attention. Whilst you're thinking of the first question, let me fill you in with a little bit of a detail. The books are available. I've also just published a new book. 5 Nights Out, Nocturnal Wildlife Ramblings with Me, and it's £1. So you can get this and this and this for £20, because then you'd give one away. Yes, question.
Just from my point of view, just that last bit that you said it's a key observation that I found is coming from South Africa, that the culling in the parks, certain things, is a huge emotional issue, and that the biggest challenge that we've had in South African context is that you've got very, very passionate people on both sides of the fence, and the people in the middle ground have been sort of forgotten about, or where it comes about is where money talks, is where the money comes, and that's unfortunately where often, and I think that happens in this country as well in terms of the the shooting industry. Same in South Africa is in terms of from the rhino poaching and side of things. It's where the money talks, and if there's enough money to pay somebody off.
I actually wrote an entire chapter of this book. The most detailed chapter I wrote, the most well-researched chapter I wrote, but at the end of it is on trophy hunting and about the money coming in for trophy hunting, killing some animals to conserve other animals. And everybody was so horrible to everybody. I actually left it underneath my bed because it's just too unpleasant. I might at some point, if I really want to lose all friends, publish it, because basically everybody gets shouted at from it. Because I was just so cross with the fact that nobody would be willing to step into the middle ground, and they would just shout at each other from over here. Is Amy here? Sorry, yes.
Would you put the signal crayfish in the same category as grey squirrels in terms of what we're dealing with now is harvesting rather than getting rid of them?
I mean, yeah, absolutely.
White-walled crayfish do.
I don't think they're doomed, but certainly there is. I mean, yeah, I can't see a way at the moment of removing all of the crayfish. I didn't do crayfish in the book. There's about 200 other examples I didn't cover in the book. But yes, I mean, exactly. It is a case of harvesting and protecting in area. You have to find a cordon sanitaire, create an area which the species you want to protect can survive, and accept that there's a whole bunch of other stuff you're going to have to adapt.
I'd like to take issue with one comment you made about the being able to restore robust ecosystems that can withstand invasives. Now, on continental land masses, this seems to work. It doesn't work on islands, because islands are essentially missing the elements of the ecosystem which are capable of dealing with the incoming invasives. And New Zealand, I've worked in Mauritius where the problems are the same. And so in somewhere like New Zealand, which had a perfectly functional ecosystem originally, nothing there previously existing would resist stones, rats, ferrets and what have you. So restoring it will never make it robust against that kind of...
And that means you're left with having to adapt to the situation. So I mean, it's a generalisation. I think the situation is made far worse by the degraded environment that is there. But it's not going to be the switch which cures everything, just to get it back. No, you're absolutely right. And I can't see a way that you cannot end up killing that. So, yes?
Where are you on the idea of an apex predator? I've sat in this room twice before with people arguing, yes, we must introduce links to control the deer population. I would like deer to be culled with a clean shot by a skilled marksman. And where the apex predators, we have a moral framework, sense of ethics, and we've banned stag hunting, fox hunting, drag hunting, etc. What's your opinion about basically culling deer with links or introducing apex predators?
I think it's a beautiful and slightly romantic vision to have to introduce a bunch of apex predators to the United Kingdom at the moment. The number of wolves that Scotland could support, given the fragmented nature of Scotland, etc., is far too small to have a massive impact on the number of deer. So you need to remove the deer. You're not going to get wolves moving into Whiteham Woods and controlling the deer in there. But that'd be interesting. But it's not something which that's never going to work. And I write quite a bit about deer in the book. I would have loved to have gone in and talked at length with the people in Whiteham, however they didn't want to let me in, wouldn't let me come along, which is a shame. But no, you're absolutely right, and we are the apex predator. I think that having a full panoply of predators would be fantastic. If only just to keep us a bit fitter when we went walking in the countryside. All that nervous energy which you're burning up. I think it is important, but that's not going to be the solution, especially with things like deer, which are on such an enormous scale. I'm sorry about that, yeah.
When you're talking about earlier about how far back in time can you go to bring back an ecosystem to a certain stage, has there a sort of say a scientific formula that could be used to decide as to, well, how far back in time, what is the relevance of what sort of creature should we be getting rid of? Should we get rid of all the cave toads in Australia? Should we get rid of the pythons in Florida?
Should we get rid of Lumbricus terrestris from North America, which has transformed the environment? Yeah, I mean, it is. So what they did on Lundy, the Landmark Trust managed Lundy, and they said, we're making it 1970. That was it. They drew the line at 1970, and so that's what they were trying. But then removed the rats as well. In terms of the building, all that stuff, that's what they're aiming for. They're not trying to get rid of all the other species which were on there beforehand, because it's never going to work. So they just arbitrarily chose the date. I think what we need to look at is not a line, but a function. So is the ecosystem being turned into a dysfunctional ecosystem because of the species, not is the species just an invasive non-native species? The vast majority of species around the world which are in places which they didn't used to be don't cause a problem. So actually drawing the line is to do with the function rather than the line and the date.
It was just on the deer population thing. Do you think there's any hope of having a system similar to the US one, of controlling deer population through like open hunting seasons at certain times of the year, or do you think we're too divided on that in the UK? Do you think that's a project that's being encouraged?
That's really interesting. I mean, I found in hunting in the United Kingdom has got a problem because it's rooted in class. And what I found, I wrote a book called Linescapes, looking at habitat fragmentation, and across continental Europe, you've got great eco-ducts across roads and railways and things where wildlife can, why do you do this? They say, well, the hunting community are really keen to make sure they can get access to their deer and their boar or whatever. And hunting in there is very much a thing that, I'd say, normal people do, because I don't actually think it's a normal thing to go and get kicks out of killing an animal when you can go and buy a block of toffee. But it's something which is a much more accepted, broader culture than it is here, where it comes with a whole bunch of baggage, of a bunch of inbred baggage. So, George.
I'm most interested in the killing the things onto which we project anthropomorphically, in particular those large kind of cushions that my Instagram calls fur babies. So could you tell us about the killing of cats, please? And the future life forms involved for that.
So when I've asked everybody about what is the biggest problem, whether it's in New Zealand, Australia, on small islands around the place, and yeah, the first thing that the conservation on the ground say, yeah, it's cats. They are the biggest problem. They have got a fantastic strategy of inveigling their way into our lives. They infect us, those of us who keep cats, with a little nematode which turns us into a gibbering idiot and meets all of their needs. That's a slight exaggeration, probably. But they are clearly the biggest problem. But, as I mentioned earlier, you have to go into each of these problems looking at not just the amount of money you've got, the ecological problems, but the social capital which is engaged with it too. And so if you don't have societal buy-in to removing cats, then you're stuffed. Lord Howe Island's an interesting case in point of Australia, where they had, first of all, it was all feral cats will be caught and killed. Nobody was too fussed about that. They're feral cats. It was done humanely. And then there was and you're not allowed to import any more cats, and all your cats have to be sterilised. And so gradually there was a drifting away of the cats from Lord Howe Island. There are no cats on Lord Howe Island. So there are ways of doing this sort of thing, but you have to do it with societal buy-in, because otherwise people will ignore it. I mean, like the research done with the lynx, yes, introduce lynx to Scotland, fantastic. However, the research shows that farmers will simply shoot them. So there's no point doing it until you've got societal buy-in. It just won't work. Yes?
I know you're a pop fan. Give us your top 3
Pop
species that you would like to remove from the UK.
From the UK? I mean, other than...
It could and should be.
Could and should. That's a very interesting thing. I mean, I think mink would be fairly high up there. I'm not going to go for the easy solutions, such as Tories. No, it's impossible because you've got an entire panoply of stuff. What I'd really like to see is having the effort put into creating a really robust ecosystem, so that the areas where it's complicated, there is much more of a cushion to allow native species to be able to flourish. Is that a horribly political answer? Sorry, Joanna is lingering. Do we have... Yeah? One more? Okay.
Hi, could I just ask, as our global climate change is getting worse, right? So I'd like to ask, should we be doing everything possible to mitigate the loss of biodiversity through culling? Because the rate of biodiversity loss through climate change could actually be more threatening to the stabilization of ecosystems.
So you mentioned something I should have mentioned in the talk about climate change, because it's really crucial, because this idea of where do you draw a line, where are we going to dip the place in aspic, is obviously nonsense, because the climate is changing and new species are moving in the entire time. So climate refugees come in many different forms. And we are going to have, this country is going to be transformed. In 100 years' time, there'll be an entirely different set of ecosystems around the place. So we can't look at setting a line and saying we're going to return it to X. As I mentioned earlier, it's about looking at function and whether the ecosystem is actually going to function in a manner which is sustainable to life, rather than trying to recreate an imagined version of what it might be if we were really, I would love it to be this, pre-Lapsarian idyll where everybody cavorted around the place eating grapes or whatever. It's just not going to happen. It's a messed up place. And we just have to work out ways of maintaining, function rather than a vision, I think.
Thank you.
Because there needs to be time to buy books.
Yes, exactly. There needs to be time to buy books. So, can we give Hugh a huge round of applause?